Trade disputes can be resolved through diplomacy, debate, or an army. What's up, MetaNerdz? Today we're going to be taking a tour of the Multi-Troop Transport, otherwise known as the MTT. We'll explore the role it played for both the Trade Federation and the CIS, delve into its cross-section, and even that time, the MTT seemingly took flight. Designed and manufactured by Bactoid Armor Workshops, the MTT was used at first by the Neimoidian-led Trade Federation. There is very little to no information about their deployment before the famous Battle of Naboo, and so before we talk history, let's take an in-depth look at the specifications of this behemoth. The Multi-Troop Transport is quite a humble name for such a monster of a machine. With a length of 35.6 meters, or approximately 117 feet long, it was longer than 19 steamrolled Gungans, but still considerably shorter than the Republic's A6 Juggernaut. And at 10.54 meters, or almost 35 feet tall, the MTT was a Yoda higher than 2 Fambas. Cargo-wise, it's estimated that the MTT could haul 12 tons. That's enough to haul 112 OOM battle droids, including their blasters, and still have enough energy to add 3.5 dewbacks. If one of these beasts showed up here on Earth, it would be as long as 14 smart cars, taller than 4 M1 Abrams tanks, and would have enough hauling power to transport 879 bars of gold. At a sluggish 35 kilometers per hour or only 22 miles per hour, the MTT isn't going to be winning any pod races. This speed makes it very vulnerable to attacks, which is why we always see it escorted with AATs, STAPs, and battle droids, or holding back towards the rear of the battlefront. To have an Earth comparison, just so you know how truly sluggish this thing is, the record for the fastest human sprint is 28 miles per hour. But then again, Usain Bolt wasn't carrying 12 tons of nasally death.
Roger, roger.
The MTT was only armed with 2 twin blaster cannons, mounted on a rotatable ball turret on the front of the vehicle. While extremely powerful and accurate, having even been said to shoot down starfighters, the placement of these guns made the transport dangerously vulnerable from any angle besides the front. And while we're on the subject, that front of the MTT is heavily armored, and not just to protect its portable pop-up army. It could also use its rounded face as a battering ram, knocking its way through walls and trees, like we saw it doing as the Trade Federation droid army was clearing a path through the dense Naboo forest. Maybe Ventress should have brought a few of these to Ragosa. There's even more going on inside of the MTT, which we can see thanks to one incredible cross-section. Starting up at the top, we see that the MTT is piloted by a battle droid, while another serves as the gunner, something similar to what we see in the AAT. These vehicles were usually on pre-programmed paths set up by the droid control ship, but the pilot could deviate from these orders when necessary. Since the model we're looking at is the original, as we move down we can get a closer look at this vehicle's most infamous feature, the droid racks. Bactoid Armor Workshop, who also made the B1s, really took advantage of designing this thing with droids in mind, as I can't really see any other army being able to take advantage of this system. The droids were folded into the fetal position, loaded up into 4 smaller racks, and stowed away safely until duty called. The base model of MTT could carry up to 112 standard OOM battle droids, and we'll discuss the variants in just a sec. We can see here that the rack is also operated by 2 OOM battle droids, an overseer and an operator. The entire forward interior, as expected, is dominated by the MTT's main feature, and so the other essentials of this transport were housed in the back. We can see the power generating cooling systems, not to mention the many vents and fins that would make sure the MTT doesn't overheat. Interestingly, the main power generators are said to be provided by Kuat drive yards, who became known throughout the galaxy for their Republic warships. I guess when both sides are secretly run by the Sith, it doesn't really matter where the credits come from. But if you want some more information on that, we actually covered this in an old video, explaining how Kuat drive yards would have ended up in the CIS, but how Palpatine's machinations made them a vehement supporter of the Republic. Now that we've covered the original, let's quickly run down the variations. As war broke out, the methodical deployment of battle droids became increasingly obsolete. To counter this, some MTTs were outfitted with new racks to drop B1 battle droids onto the field already standing upright. While this did fix the issue with the speed of deployment, it did limit how many droids could be brought into the battlefront. This design seemed to be considered an improvement, as we see MTTs throughout the Clone Wars being used to quickly drop off super battle droids, of which it could only carry 12 at a time. We see them doing just that during the Battle of Dathomir, littering this red jungle world with dozens of clankers. This version, as well as others used by the CIS, were given a paint job to better match the blue and gray look of the Confederacy. Another time to see the MTT variant was during Wat Tambor's occupation of Ryloth, where this sleazy Skakoan used 2 of these transports to haul treasure back to his palace. While we never see the full interior of these models, it could be assumed that the droid racks were removed, giving Tambor even more cargo space for his riches. New model or not, we do get to see a new feature of the MTT, the cargo hatch, where Mace Windu alongside Razor and Stack were hiding. We see that it has more than enough room for the cargo, and maybe Tambor would have gotten away with it if he put a couple droidicas in there as well. As we see, the cross-section also says how it was great for transporting destroyer droids. The history of the MTT is pretty straightforward, having almost nothing before its appearance on the plains of Naboo. The Trade Federation deployed at least 12, which combined could deploy 1,452 droids. Flanked by AATs and STAPs, the MTTs stayed out of the line of fire as the army that they brought to bear had seemingly won the day. That was until a certain chosen one interfered, shutting down the entire droid army. After their debut, we see the MTTs being used throughout the Clone Wars as previously mentioned. But Baktoid also continued to innovate new transports for the CIS. These included the MUT and Trade Federation Troop Transport. Think Flying MTT. But ultimately, the multi-troop transport remained the go-to vehicle for most of the war. Other notable times that we see the MTT in use was during the Battle of Kashyyyk, and even the Battle of Coruscant. When unable to use the MTT to deploy troops, the CIS often made use of the HMP droid gunship to quickly fly in clankers alongside a devastating barrage of suppressive fire, like we saw in Scipio. The influence of the MTT's design was also seen in one of the deadliest creations ever brought out by Baktoid, the Super Tank. Like all things Confederacy, the MTT saw the end of its glory days when Darth Vader ended the Clone Wars on Mustafar. While it has been said that the MTT did see later action in the Galactic Civil War, it did not play a notable role in any key battles. Well, that about wraps it up for the MTT, but you definitely want to stick around for these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. It was originally designed to look like a train, but the final look for the MTT took a cue from nature thanks to Doug Chang, with its tall facade and chin guns made to resemble an African elephant's skull and tusks. And while not much changed regarding the MTT and its switch from Legends to canon, it did receive a bit of meddling. It went from 31 meters long in Legends to 35.6 in canon. Strangely though, it shrunk in height, going from 13 meters tall to just 10.54 meters. Cross-section comes from Star Wars Complete Cross-Sections, and additional information comes from Star Wars Encyclopedia of Starfighters and Other Vehicles, and Ultimate Star Wars. But most important of all, remember, with the MTT, an entire army is just a carry-on, and the Force will be with you, always.
I smell fear, and it smells good.
What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is all about who is perhaps the most skilled tactician in the Separatist Navy, the notorious and seemingly invincible Admiral Trench. Trench is a member of the Harch species, an arachnid-like race of beings from the planet Secundus Ando. He's a remarkably tough Harch, having participated and presumably died in several naval engagements, only to keep reappearing to haunt the Republic. So we'll get into his complete history, how he survived the destruction of the Invincible, and even some behind-the-scenes facts. Makes his first notable appearance during the Clone Wars on the side of the CIS. But his history as a feared and revered naval leader begins with the Battle of Malastare Narrows, several years before the Clone Wars even began. During this time, before the creation of the Separatist Alliance by Count Dooku, Trench served the Corporate Alliance, which was allowed to have what amounted to its own private navy in order to protect their business interests, with Trench being a sort of private sector defense contractor. You'll notice that these trade groups would go on to make up the backbone of the Separatist military, so it was a natural transition for Admiral Trench. Over Malastare, he blockaded the planet on the behalf of the CA, leading a sector fleet to strangle the planet into submission, similar to what the Trade Federation would do over Naboo. The Republic arrived in the system with its own fleet, initially consisting of judicial forces. This pre-clone military peacekeeping force had some notable members like Wilf Tarkin and Wolf Yularen. It would be Yularen who was sent over Malastare, and suffice it to say, the mission did not go well for the Republic fleet, as Trench systematically tore their ships apart one by one, having mastered the art of these planetary blockades. Trench would ultimately be defeated, however, after a Jedi task force intervened and put an end to the corporate fleet scheme over Malastare.
A corporate fleet was blockading Malastare, a fleet led by Trench. He tore our ships apart. We barely escaped with our lives. And a Jedi-led task force moved in to settle the matter. Trench's ship was destroyed, and we assumed he went down with it.
The Harch was presumed dead when his cruiser was destroyed by the Jedi, but he would eventually resurface as an admiral in the Separatist Navy and wage war against the Galactic Republic, seeking vengeance on the Jedi Order that had once outsmarted him.
If you are listening, Jedi, you've made a bold move and a grave mistake.
When we next meet Trench, he is once again leading a blockade, but this time it's over the crystalline world of Christophsis. This world was crucial to the Republic, as it is one of the few Outer Rim worlds that did not secede to join the CIS. While Republic Senator Bail Organa and his task force of clone troopers were stranded on the planet's surface, a Republic fleet consisting of 4 Venator-class Star Destroyers and 3 supply ships attacked and tried to break the blockade, hoping to deliver some much-needed relief supplies to the Republic forces and civilian population. Trench's blockade outnumbered the Republic ships considerably, consisting of several Lucrehulk battleships, munificent frigates, and a jewel of the CIS Navy, a Providence-class dreadnought named the Invincible. This particular dreadnought, while similar in appearance to the invisible hand favored by General Grievous, is actually much larger. More than double the standard Providence, this supersized 2-kilometer-long version was a fitting flagship for Admiral Trench. One of the Invincible's key features, other than its vast array of turbolasers, were its absurdly powerful shields that were able to withstand the barrage from an entire Republic fleet. With this, he was able to challenge Anakin Skywalker's fleet, literally chasing the Republic off to go hide behind a nearby moon.
Tell the transports to fall back to Obi-Wan's position. We'll cover their retreat as they escape behind the moon.
The Invincible's shields would, however, be its undoing, as they took a while to recharge once lowered, perhaps creating a false sense of confidence on the Admiral's part. His tactical droid would inform him that in order to fire torpedoes at Anakin's prototype stealth ship, the Invincible would have to lower its shields. And these torpedoes were crucial for targeting the magnetic signature of this otherwise invisible ship. In this battle between Invisible and Invincible, Anakin was able to pull off an impressive maneuver, having the torpedoes follow his ship, but then racing towards the bridge of the Invincible, leading the torpedoes right into the bridge of Admiral Trench's hubris-infused vessel. The explosion seems to have set off a chain reaction, and again seemingly killed the Admiral. However, he did survive, but in explaining this, I'm going to give away some details from the Tarkin novel, and later this video will get into some spoilers for Clone Wars Season 7. So just a heads up. Somehow, he was able to survive this devastating blow to his prized dreadnought, and though we cannot know for sure, the canon novel Tarkin seems to spell it out for us. What we saw over Christophsis was the destruction of the bridge and much of the upper level of the Invincible. But we don't see it explode, it's not blown into a billion pieces. In fact, there's such large sections of this ship left over that early rebels used them to fight the Empire. Birch Teller's warship, which to bring things full circle was hunted by the now Imperial Tarkin, was a ship made from cobbled together parts of CIS warships, including those from Admiral Trench's Invincible. When we see Trench re-emerge during the battle over Ringo Vinda, which is a massive orbital space station encircling an entire planet, we see that he is now a cyborg, having several robotic arms, a new cybernetic eye, and even a large section of his skull, perhaps even his brain. So this time he was severely injured, even though last time he cheated death he survived without any visible damage. So it seems like he was blown backwards, down the bridge, or even into a lower deck, and could have escaped via the confusion via a myriad of shuttles, pods, or starfighters that all would have been packed into a supersized Providence class. There were a ton of other CIS ships in the blockade as well, and so the battle wouldn't have ended immediately, and thus there was tons of chaos for Trench to slip away in. This seems all but explicitly stated in those details from the Tarkin novel. But comment down below what you think makes the most sense to you. Over Ringo Vinda, Trench was in control of a significant portion of the station as Republic forces sought to drive him out.
Increase our defenses. We must hold them here.
Several Jedi had been committed to the task of defeating Trench, including Anakin and the sisters Tiplar and Tipley, along with scores of elite clone troopers. Trench's droid army had been pushed to its breaking point, but as he watched the battle from inside his command center, he witnessed something utterly unexpected. Trench watched as a clone trooper simply walked up and executed the Jedi General Tiplar.
Lost our momentum! Fall back!
This shock caused the Republic advance to falter, and the Jedi and clones were forced to retreat. Puzzled by the incident, Trench reported what he saw to Count Dooku, who demanded that Trench capture this clone. The Admiral succeeded with the use of V-2 rocket troopers, and Tup was temporarily a prisoner of war, though a covert operations Edda-class shuttle would help to bring him back. And this would be the last we see of Admiral Trench over Ringo Vinda. The Harch's final engagement would take place over Anaxis, one of the Republic's key ship manufacturing worlds. Under a ruthless siege by the Admiral, the shipyard's production efforts were brought to a halt, and the Republic was forced to spend vast amounts of clones and resources to take them back, including one of the most elite and unorthodox units to ever leave Kamino, the Bad Batch. The Republic couldn't figure out how they kept losing to Trench. Though he was considered a military genius, this was just a bit too much. They were losing on every front and would quickly lose the entire planet if nothing changed. Unbeknownst to the Jedi, Trench was able to hold on to a prisoner of war, a clone ARC trooper who was thought to be long dead. Cybernetically accessing the mind of Echo, Republic war strategies were revealed, allowing Trench to lead his droid armies using a special algorithm that could predict Republic strategies before they even made them. merging Echo's mind with advanced AI to reveal patterns which Republic commanders weren't even aware they were falling into, and thus those predictions were given to Trench before his enemies even started mobilizing. The Jedi became suspicious, and eventually discovered Trench's algorithm and organized a strike team to recapture this imprisoned trooper. And using Echo's inside knowledge of the Separatists, they could feed Trench false intelligence. The Admiral would fall for this trap, and ultimately meet his true end once and for all by the lightsaber of Anakin Skywalker, the bright blue blade piercing through his chest. This soon-to-fall Jedi looking the cybernetic heart in his many eyes to confirm this specter that had haunted the Republic from even before the Clone Wars was now finally drained of life. And as if this wasn't enough, Anakin would allow Bad Batch to detonate the deceased Admiral's flagship, causing a massive explosion that destroyed what remained of Trench, his entire ship, and several other nearby Separatist ships, resulting in a Republic victory over Anaxis. So that's it for Admiral Trench. He really did die that time. But before you go, here are some cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. His voice actor is D. Bradley Baker, who did the voices for the clone troopers in the TV series. Admiral Trench is of course based on spiders found here on Earth, having 8 limbs, 4 on each side, this large array of eyes, and the spider-like pincers or pedipalps on the face. We can't actually find this clip from the unfinished Season 7 episodes, the ones that came out a couple years ago, but the voice actor that was just standing in for Trench reading through the lines refers to him as Taranch, like tarantula. If you want to pick up that canon Tarkin book mentioned, it is linked down below. I really enjoyed the audiobook version myself. It was really cool to see the early group of rebels that are still not unified into a rebel alliance, and of course it got that cool remnant of CIS stuff floating around. But most important of all, remember, at least certain modules of the ship were invincible. And the Force will be with you, always. Though a Mandalorian could easily kill you with their bare hands, their impressive weaponry certainly helped. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video will cover all of the weapons used by the Mandalorians over the years. From conquering the deadly beasts that roamed their homeworld, namely the Mythosaur, and later waging wars against the Jedi and Sith alike, this all cultivated a warrior's mentality amongst their people, and they've been ruled by the best of their warriors for millennia. Despite their relatively small numbers by the Imperial era, they've always had a massive impact on galactic history, all with the help of their incredible arms, armor, and tech. So we'll cover all of it in both Legends and canon, multiple millennia of violent history, but let's start with one of the most important weapons from canon. Thousands of years before the Battle of Yavin, Tari Vizsla became the first Mandalorian to join the Jedi Order, and created the Darksaber, a unique lightsaber with a more sword-like design and black marbled blade. He used this blade to be the first to unite the many warring Mandalorian tribes. Since then, it has been a symbol of leadership, being wielded by whoever currently rules the Mandalorians, Force-sensitive or not. We've seen it in the hands of Pre Vizsla, Darth Maul, Sabine Wren, Bo-Katan Kryze, and currently Moff Gideon, who likely acquired it after he participated in the Siege of Mandalore. Sometime after Vizsla's passing, Mandalore the Great led the united Mandalorians to wage war against the Jedi.
The songs of eons past tell of battles between Mandalore the Great and an order of sorcerers called Jedi.
While the war ended with the desolation of Mandalore, confining its inhabitants to sealed dome cities, they did mount a successful attack on the Jedi Temple, where they retrieved the Darksaber.
This lightsaber was stolen from your Jedi Temple by my ancestors during the fall of the Old Republic.
This war would come to shape much of the future of the Mandalorians in canon. In order to fight their greatest opponent yet, they had to develop a combat style that utilized a unique and varied arsenal with ranged weapons and hand-to-hand combat techniques. Beskar armor was also first developed during this period, and it was of great use against the Jedi. The ore could be turned into Beskar steel, and was found only on Mandalore in its moon Concordia, and it was resistant to lightsabers. This armor was worn over a body glove or jumpsuit, and almost always had a distinctive chest plate made of 4 separate Beskar plates, as well as a helmet which retained the distinct T-shaped visors of the most ancient of the Mandalorians. Mando armor was usually painted to represent the wearer's clan or allegiance, but Sabine Wren says that she painted hers herself after it was passed down to her through multiple generations. Among the weapons the Mandalorians developed to fight the Jedi was a concealed retractable vibroblade in the glove, which could sometimes be used to parry a Jedi attack or surprise an opponent who thought that they were giving up and that they were unarmed. Mandalorians of the Clone Wars era favored the Westar 34 and 35, which were Mandalorian designed and produced blaster pistols, and famously could be dual-wielded, as we saw with Jango Fett and Pre Vizsla respectively, while the unidentified Death Watch carbine seems to be a scaled-up version of the Westar 35. In Legends, we also saw the Westar M5 blaster rifle, a modular system that was used by bounty hunters and later the Empire, but most notably by the Legends ARC Trooper Alpha 17. Many may remember Darth Vader's iconic "no disintegration" line, which was directed at Boba Fett. And after all these years, we finally see what he meant by this. The M-Bun Disruptor Rifle would instantly turn biological matter into a pile of ash, a weapon that was actually banned by the Empire. Now, during the Clone Wars, this once proud warrior race had become pacifist under the leader of Satine Kryze, exiling any militant Mandalorians to the Moon of Concordia, which is where Pre Vizsla formed Death Watch, a secret order which intended to maintain the culture's ancient warrior code. Throughout the Clone Wars, they were seen as enemies, even terrorists by many, but they were also known to rescue populations from the CIS army. As we see, Death Watch would rescue the child that would grow up to be known as the Mandalorian, and we see them wielding a weapon that's similar but not identical to Boba Fett's EE-3 blaster rifle, and so it's likely a earlier or related model. Perhaps the most important part of the arsenal of the Mandalorians were their combat vambraces, which were their wrist guards that contained various weapons while still keeping their hands free. Some could fire these explosive darts, and there was even an attachment that would make a small personal shield. The most popular weapon used in these vambraces were the wrist-mounted flamethrowers, aka the ZX miniature flame projector, but it could also house whipcord launchers, and both were very difficult for Jedi to counter. Their lightsabers could of course not deflect fire, and they could be bound by a successful whipcord shot, allowing the Mando to either close in for a kill or bring them in hot, just in case they had a rather expensive bounty. However, many of these vambraces also had other attachments like concealed wrist blasters used by the Fets, or the mini saw blade launchers used by Pre Vizsla. Perhaps the most deadly were the Whistling Birds, tiny homing micro-missiles which were used by the Mando to instantly take out 4 stormtroopers who had surrounded him. But they were very limited due to their use of Beskar.
Use them sparingly, for they are rare.
Which allowed them to punch through armor, but of course was increasingly harder to find, and so far it's the only known canon weapon that's made from this ore. As for tech, their magnetized boots and jetpacks also gave them amazing maneuverability, sometimes better than even a Jedi. While the exact models were of course refined over time, during the late Republic and Imperial eras they were known to use the Z6 jetpack, which included a back-mounted rocket launcher, and was effective against everything from infantry to even shooting down starships. And as we saw with Obi-Wan and Satine, they could actually circle back to track their target, though how exactly they locked on is unknown. And then there was the lighter JT-12 variant. Those trained in the school of the Rising Phoenix used jetpacks most effectively, as they did require a lot of practice and training to control. Now of course, Beskar is an incredibly strong metal and the pride of the Mandalorians, so why didn't they make more weapons out of it? Well, they did, but only in Legends. The Beskad was the traditional sword of the Mandalorians. It was under 2 feet long, but made of a hefty Beskar blade, and so it could be used to bash down an enemy's defenses, as there are very few materials that are actually stronger than Beskar. These are made much like real-life katanas, with the metalsmith folding the Beskar many times to create a very strong blade with a razor-sharp edge. And fittingly, they carry much of the significance of their real-world counterparts, being a weapon that was prized in their culture due to the skill needed to craft it, and seen as a source of pride for hundreds of years, even as more advanced technology came about. While much like the Darksaber in canon, in Legends it would be the battle axe that symbolized the leader of Mandalore. Mandalore the Ultimate would craft one from the wreckage of a Republic capital ship, an inexpugnable to be exact, with the head being made of metal sheets, but also lined with Christophsis for a lightsaber blocking effect. This was a modernized version of the ancient Mythosaur axe, which originally was made from the calcified bones of the terrifying mythosaurs that once ruled Mandalore, before the warriors made them extinct and turned them into the galaxy's most feared and recognized sigil. There was also the Crush Gaunt, or in Mandalorian, the Shukuruk, a heavy glove covered in Beskar plates that significantly increased the wearer's hand strength. It was said that someone wearing the Crush Gaunt would be able to crush metal, rock, or bone in their hand. Because of this, they were often used to easily snap an opponent's neck, or even could be used to catch and hold a lightsaber blade in the wearer's hand. Something that surely would have been a shock to any Jedi unlucky enough to go head-to-head with a Mandalorian wearing these gauntlets. But despite their amazing arsenal, they could not hold out against the sheer numbers of the Empire. Thus they were beaten into submission after the Siege of Mandalore, in which most of their forces were wiped out. Moff Gideon knows that to the Mandalorians, this is known as the Night of 1,000 Tears.
Songs of the Siege of Mandalore, when gunships outfitted with similar ordnance laid waste to fields of Mandalorian recruits.
We know little of this night besides the fact that it led to the seizure of most of their Beskar and drove out most of the remaining Mandalorian warriors into hiding. Gar Saxon, a Mandalorian who joined the Imperials, was installed as the Imperial Viceroy of Mandalore.
Worse, they're traitors, Mandalorians who serve the Empire.
Saxon also led the Imperial Commandos, a highly elite group of Mandalorians who swore service to the Empire. It wore sleeker, all-white armor that blended the traditional Mando aesthetics with the traditional Stormtrooper armor design. But interestingly, it was still made from the reforged Beskar captured during the sieges, and they wielded traditional Westar blaster carbines. Since Mandalorian training was of course far better than anything the Empire could offer, they were among the most elite of the Empire's forces. Before them, during the Clone Wars, was the Mandalorian Protectors, also known as the Royal Guards that were meant to protect the ruler of Mandalore, and try and maintain a balance in their warrior culture. They can be seen in the Clone Wars protecting Duchess Satine before Death Watch gained control. They were also brought in to train clones, much like in Legends, and sometimes even fought alongside them. Years later, in order to protect themselves from decimation, their leader Fen Rao reluctantly signed a treaty with the Empire, swearing loyalty. And here we can see that the Mandalorians weren't just excellent warriors, they were also good pilots, as when they first met, the Protectors were able to wipe out a squad of A-Wings and nearly killed the rebel leader Hera Syndulla. During the Clone Wars, their primary starfighter was the Comer class, also known as the Gauntlet Fighter, and these are also prominently used by Death Watch, and these are manufactured by their native Mandel motors. Darth Maul would fly his own Comer class fighter named the Night Brother for about 17 years, coming from his takeover of Mandalore near the end of the Clone Wars. During the reign of the Empire, the Protectors would use the similar Fang class fighter, as they were one of the few people to secure a contract from the Empire that allowed them to produce these starfighters openly, and they worked in some improvements over the Comer. Not only would the whole wing engine assembly pivot to allow for vertical takeoff and landing, but it could also rotate during flight, and allowing the wing-mounted laser cannons to be fired with minimal reposition of the ship. So that's it for their armor, arms, tech, and even starfighters over the years. But you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. Capitalizing on the look of one of the most loved characters from the original trilogy, George Lucas wanted to tie the clone troopers to Jango and Boba Fett, and so that's what inspired the look of the Phase 1 clone trooper armor. There's tons of debate over whether or not the Fetts should be true Mandalorians. At once, Lucas definitely implied that, and later said that he didn't want them to be so. And in the Clone Wars episode, The Mandalorian Plot, it stated that he was never a member of the Mandalorian culture. But keep in mind, these are other Mandalorians deciding who is not a true Mandalorian, as there was this tension between becoming peace-loving people and staying warriors. The Mandalorian's Ambon Disruptor Rifle is based on the weapon Boba Fett was carrying during his first appearance. Not in Empire, or even in the New Hope re-release, but in the Star Wars Christmas special. And so you could say this is also the first appearance of Mandalorian armor. But most important of all, remember, there's no such thing as a disarmed Mandalorian, and the Force will be with you, always.
What are we going to do? We'll be sent to the spice mines of Kessel or smashed into who knows what.
What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is going to be a complete breakdown of the spice capital of the galaxy, Kessel. This will be everything in canon, and I'll get a separate Legends version up soon, because Kessel is actually one of the most changed planets in the lore, even being changed up a bunch in just Legends. So to make it all coherent, let's get into the canon version of this infamous and crucial world. Starting with its location, you can find it at grid coordinates T10, in the Outer Rim territories within the eponymous Kessel system, just outside of Hutt space. The planet has at least one moon, and a diameter of 7,200 kilometers, or 4,474 miles, making it more than half the size of Earth and Coruscant. The orbital period, or its year length, is 322 days, while the rotational period, or day, is 12 hours. And here are those respective stats for Coruscant and Tatooine. Its atmosphere ranged from mild tropical to being extremely hot, so much so that it was dangerous to a lot of the slave populations.
Slaves sent there last a few months, maybe a year.
And for Wookiees born in the forest, it's a death sentence.
And speaking of slave labor, it gets us into the first of many dark aspects of this world. The official report from the Coruscant census has Kessel's population at 10,000. Relatively low, it may only represent that royal city and some of the mining operators, as it appears like hundreds if not thousands of slaves work in just a single mine. So it is likely that something as mundane as a census report reveals some of what Ahsoka was talking about. Now the Republic should get involved, but layers of corruption keep this planet free from judicial intervention.
It's legendary. Yeah, it's legendary for its corruption.
Of course, it was the endless flow of credits from this planet that kept officials looking the other way, as even the naive Trace grew up hearing stories about how criminals, pirates, and smugglers achieved great riches from this mysterious world of Kessel. So everyone knew what was going on here, from the Jedi in their temple to the mechanic down in 1313. But the official fallback excuse was that the spice mined here was for medicinal purposes.
In this time of war, our spice is refined into a medicine that saves people across the galaxy.
And this was technically true. If refined in the right way, it could act as a stimulant keeping people alive, or as a sedative to reduce pain. but that's also true for most illicit drugs. And of course, Bacta was by far the primary source of medical treatment in the galaxy, being the go-to everywhere from the battlefront to medical space stations. So everyone knew the truth that it was the dangerous drugs that were brokered through the Yoruba family to the Pike Syndicate. The Pikes were one of the most powerful crime syndicates out there, but their advantage was that their homeworld and base of operations, Obadiah, was located in the same Kessel sector. This world was known to have endless shipments of spice and credits coming and going, and so was a constant site of brazen pirate attacks. But at least this relative proximity made it a bit easier to patrol. And of course, just getting to the planet itself was particularly hazardous.
The Acades Maelstrom.
A series of navigation beacons were required to guide ships through the storm, which was a torrent of true horrors.
Carbon bergs, size of planets crashing into each other. It's ionized gas, water vapor, possibly vacuum-breathing life forms swirling around the maw. Only way in or out is this channel.
Constant friction lightning events, billions of carbon bergs and ice chunks, and most terrifyingly, the enormous Summa Verminoth. This tentacled beast descended on any ship that tried to take a shortcut through the Maelstrom, and just added to the mystery and lore surrounding the drug capital. If you did safely make it to planetside, you were met with two strikingly different hemispheres. The south was home to lush rainforests as far as the eye could see, providing excellent views, wildlife, and a mild climate. But nearly the entire northern hemisphere was devoted to mining spice, coaxium, Kesseline, and the Kessel stones. The Yoruba royal family is likely human, as most of the staff and guards are human, but their major domo Kanash Locke was a Twi'lek. Not much is known about the Yorubas, but they certainly were willing to sacrifice this world to earn as much credits as possible. It's unclear how long this royal family inhabited Kessel. There really aren't any ancient accounts of human settlers or anything like that, but ruling what provided nearly all of the galaxy's spice must have made them incredibly powerful. The Pikes seem to have exclusive rights to the sale of this raw spice, but we see for employment they also use the Zygerians. We see the Dockmaster as a Zygerian, whose people are notorious for running one of the longest operating, largest, and particularly cruel slave empires, and who were opposed by the Jedi since the time of the Old Republic. If we go down into one of these mines, we see just how many were subject to these horrible conditions.
Those are not droids. They're people.
These slaves were of all sorts of species, and even what looks like a child right here. In the back there are some notable giant spider mining droids, and they had the loader droids that actually pack on the big crates of unrefined spice into ships. Though this flat plate on their back seems like it could fold down and work like the organic slaves, carrying these bucket-sized loads on their back. And then we also see these large platforms for bringing up massive equipment and enormous hauls of spice, but most of the transporting of this spice is in these buckets, that we see on the backs of slaves and being brought up these intimidating steps. It's hard to tell, but it seems to be around 500 feet tall, something like a 50-story building or 200 steps, and honestly I think that's underestimating it. During the Imperial era, it seems like the spread of these mining sites increased, as the surface becomes even more noxious. When you break Kessel stone to extract the spice, there are pockets of poisonous gas that are released into the atmosphere, sometimes just enough to make you woozy, but presumably if there was too much it could kill some of these organic slaves. And then there was also the refinement of Kesseline. From that same stone you could either go the powder drug route or the liquid fuel route, all depending on how you refined it. Kesseline had this bright green appearance, and was refined in these large open air pools. This was said to leak into the aquifer, which combined with the noxious air being released, made many feel that Kessel was far beyond ever reverting back to the lush rainforest it once was. This larger circular site we see in 19 BBY is very similar, if not the same place visited by the Spectres in 5 BBY. Called Spice Mine K-76, by 5 BBY it was mostly worked by Wookiees, and this is actually something we see develop over the decades, as the slave population becomes more specialized over the years, having few if any Wookiees in the beginning, a ton of Dwoonie, Gigaron, humans, and Twi'leks, to mostly Wookiee but still some other species by 10 BBY when Solo and company paid a visit, then almost exclusively Wookiee in 5 BBY. This is because right after the Clone Wars, the Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk was taken over by the Imps, and the Empire tried to capture the entire race for slave labor. They had a long history of Jedi alliance and independence, and of course their natural physical ability was a threat to the Empire. So by turning them into slaves, they killed two birds with one Kessel stone. Instead of becoming really powerful rebel allies, they were now really powerful slave workers. But I can't miss this opportunity to quickly tell you the story of this guy, a human slave, Tak. He was a con man from Coruscant, and he actually tried to rob Princess Yoruba when she was visiting the capital. He was captured, he received Kessel-style justice, and was thrown into the mines. We don't know much about this slave process, but the droid L3 gives us some very vague and ominous details.
Director Tolside said our slaves should follow those guys to get clipped and tagged.
What are they clipping?
And there are these dedicated slave inspectors who look for physical signs of strength or weakness. With this pike run mine, we see that it's cut differently, more squared than the large circle of 76. It does seem like the pikes are in full control of this mine, and so I wouldn't put it past Maul's Crimson Dawn to just take out King Yoruba, literally cutting out the middleman. When the Empire rose, they likely would have let the criminals stay in control of this infamous world, while still keeping a close eye on it. Much like they did with the Hutts, keeping the criminals in direct control of the underworld, but making sure the crime bosses knew that their reign was only on the permission of the Emperor. And because of so many natural restrictions to this world, those narrow passes made it very easy to blockade all of the exits from Kessel. With this station, we see how so many were kept in the control by so few. This one center could control the mine via a wide array of droids, ubiquitous surveillance equipment, and guards stationed throughout with disabling stun weapons. The droids too were kept in their own form of slavery via restraining bolts. When these were removed and the droids received some motivation from L3, all Kessel broke loose. A side note here is that the mines of Kessel were so universally feared that the word became synonymous with hell, with phrases like I just used, and the equivalent to damned being kesseled. For instance, you would say the voyage was kesseled from the start. And we even get a hint at some of this with C-3PO.
What are we going to do? We'll be sent to the spice mines of Kessel or smashed into who knows what.
So even the fate of droids on Kessel sent chills down the circuits of droids everywhere. Now there are some other very interesting details from this particular mine. We see that one of the rarest fuels in the galaxy, coaxium, is also mined here. This hyperfuel could be used to line hyperdrives and actually initiate that interdimensional transition. Or if it was used as regular fuel, it was so potent that a tiny amount could fuel whole fleets. And a single drop could output enormous power via a ship's standard engines. This was kept behind a large vault and worth an incredible amount of credits. We also see some of the defenses there, many guns ranging from the power output of an E-Web to something similar to the P-towers we saw on Hoth, all encircling the opening of the mine. And we saw that when Kira threw those explosives, it set off a chain reaction, either igniting some of the Kesseline, the Tabana gas reserves for those weapons, or both. And also, if you look close, everything is coated in this yellowish powder, produced in the mining of the Kessel Stone, and it coats everything from the equipment to the people. Just about everything has this yellow layer on it. And it's important to remember that this place was not only hell for the slaves that work there, but also the countless beings across the galaxy that became addicted to these drugs, suffering in their own personal hells. With the lower levels of Coruscant being the Pike's main spice market, their customers withered away and lost their minds, bringing this hell off of Kessel and into themselves, their families, and their communities. So that's it for the breakdown and history of Kessel, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. Spice having medical benefits is a funny backstory. Author Kevin J. Anderson of Jedi Search, released in 1994, said that there was pressure from what he described as politically correct individuals at Lucasfilm that didn't like that spice being a drug made Han Solo a drug smuggler. But Lucas confirmed, spice is a drug. So to find a middle, he wrote in that there were some medicinal uses as well. He didn't mention this, but it also would make it so that Uncle Owen told Luke that his dad was a navigator of a drug freighter. And of course, spice is a reference to the novel Dune, which a lot of things, even sand crawlers, were taken from by name. In the novel, spice is also a drug, dangerous to mine, but also has some really important and positive uses as well. That con man Tak is played by Anthony Daniels, or C-3PO, and was a reference to the droid's fears in A New Hope. In the original script, then called Journey of the Wills Part 1, it's actually spelled Kissel, K-I-S-S-E-L, and a certain Grand, with an E at the end, Moff Tarkin, led the Kesselian Dragoons. And the Kessel Run, the name of the route that we see Solo and team take through the Maelstrom, wasn't the only way to get to Kessel. It was the quickest, and pilots would boast about who could make it through the run the fastest, as this was a good thing to have on your spice running resume. But there was also the Pablos Leon, a more traditional hyperspace route through this sector, and the Sanity Skip, a more secretive route used by pirates and some smugglers, which takes you from Kessel out to Oseon. And remember, we'll do a whole separate Legends version of this video, as almost all of this information is wildly different and really interesting. While additional information in canon comes from the books Ultimate Star Wars, Solo Visual Dictionary, Smuggler's Run, The Galactic Explorer's Guide, and The Galactic Atlas. That's it for Kessel, but most important of all, remember, he who controls the spice controls the universe. Unless he's Maul in charge of Crimson Dawn, in which case he's just a great tragic character. And the Force will be with you. Always. You lose to teddy bears once, and everyone forgets that you're one of the most elite troopers in the entire Empire. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is going to cover the Scout Troopers, everything from their wide array of tech, weapons, and training, to their history stretching back to the Clone Wars, through the Empire, and into the Imperial Remnant, and even some of their darker uses by Palpatine and Vader, moving away from recon and becoming elite death squads, and of course ending with some behind-the-scenes facts. Let's start with their role and equipment. A key element in the Stormtrooper Corps, Imperial Scout Troopers focused on ground reconnaissance. While performing roles that standard infantry, both the Stormtroopers and the Imperial Army were not trained or equipped for. A major aspect of Scout Trooper duties consisted of patrolling and investigating large areas through the use of speeder bikes, much like their predecessors, the ARF, or Advanced Reconnaissance Force Troopers of the Clone Army. This specialization in speeder bikes got them the common nickname of Imperial Biker Scouts. Initially, Scout Troopers would ride the 614 AVA speeder bikes, but later move on to the more common 74Z model, which we would see them using throughout most of the Galactic Civil War, and this was retained by the Remnant forces. Though there were times when Scout Troopers would also utilize the all-terrain recon transports that were also once used by ARF Troopers. The standard blaster for the recon troops was the EC-17 holdout blaster pistol, which could be fired using a pressure plate to make up for the heavier gloves of the troopers. This pistol was built for shorter ranges, but did include a low magnification scope, and some came equipped with a strobing flashlight that could temporarily blind enemies. Alongside this standard pistol, they were usually outfitted one of two ways. Some Scout Troopers would be set up for long-range combat, wielding either an E-11S sniper rifle or a DLT-19X targeting rifle, and relying on their knowledge and training to assist Imperial forces by taking out opposition from afar. Some of these Scout Trooper snipers were equipped with gray armor rather than white. Alternatively, they could also be seen equipped with electro-batons for use in a melee role. This was especially seen on planets such as Kashyyyk, Zepho, and on the Inquisitorial Fortress. These melee troopers had a battery pack and wiring affixed to their armor to power these batons, while other Scout Troopers had access to R1 or R4 recon droids, along with auto turrets, missile launchers, and shock or fragmentation grenades, and of course the standard Imperial E-11 blaster. In addition to all that, ones in the field would also have survival kits, rations and water, micro cords for scaling things or setting up tripwires, heat packs, water purifiers, grappling hooks, flares, and a camouflage tent. The Scout Trooper armor was lighter and covered less of the body than the armor of most other Stormtrooper variants, allowing for increased motion and speed at the cost of protection. The faceplate of a Scout Trooper helmet could fold upwards, allowing a Scout to get some fresh air or observe the scene with their own eyes. And we see that Scout Trooper commanders would often wear an orange pauldron to signify their ranks, with the overall design of the armor coming from that of the Clone Wars Phase 2 Scout gear, which we get a really good look at during the Battle of Kashyyyk, used by the 41st Elite Corps. But there's also a variant of Scout Trooper armor utilized in colder climates, such as Hoth or Renvar, and consisted of a modified helmet with polarized snow goggles, additional joint armor, and a backpack that plugs directly into the speeder bike's heating system. In addition, these Snow Scout Troopers would wear white snow gear under the armor, as opposed to the standard black bodysuit. And then there was also the modified version used by the Imperial Storm Commandos, which were an even more elite Imperial force, who looked very similar but in all black. Patrol Troopers were the high-density urban brothers to the Scout Troopers, and thus more specialized for urban combat, and for doing speeder patrols in highly populated areas, such as Coronet City on Corellia. The most well-known forefathers of the Imperial Scouts were those Republic 41st Elite Corps. After Order 66 and the death of their commander, Gree, the clone commander Faye was put in charge of them, and they were able to defeat Jedi General Luminara, but Quinlan Vos was able to individually fight off and escape these clones. With Palpatine now as Emperor, the first generation of Imperial Scout Troopers were still clones, though when Jango's template was retired, they were replaced with regular human soldiers. Over the years, a level of animosity built up between the Scout Troopers and the other segments of the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps, with everyone else seeing the Scout Troopers as disruptive and unpredictable. The Imperial military found it difficult to integrate these fiercely independent troopers, and the Scouts saw themselves as superior to the other troopers. In one notable incident, the 439th Legion Scout Brigade was riding speeders through the halls of an Imperial base on the planet Biss, just for their own entertainment late at night, which led to them being removed from the regular troopers, as Imperial personnel were angered and understandably worried that the other troopers would riot and try and kill the scout troopers. The scouts were deployed in a large variety of locations, especially those in wilderness areas such as Kashyyyk and the forest moon Endor. But most of the planets under Imperial control had at least one garrison of scout troopers. But right after the Clone Wars, they were focused on some of the former Separatist worlds like Felucia and Raxus Prime, perhaps in an effort to track down any Separatist holdouts. While they were also placed inside of and around the former Jedi Temple, providing constant security at one of Palpatine's most prized possessions. As with most trooper variants, Darth Vader's Death Squadron had a group of scout troopers who ended up joining the fight at the Battle of Hoth, seeing it as a decisive victory even without the capture of Rebel leadership. While they also assisted the Dark Lord in his hunt for Luke and Leia, while at other times they were ordered by the Imperial Security Bureau, and there are several incidents where the ISB would instruct them to massacre civilian populations, presumably being able to do this without leaving a trace. But the most famous record of Scout Troopers' actions is, ironically, their greatest defeat. During the Battle of Endor in 4ABY, the Scout Trooper Battalion there, along with the rest of the Moon's Imperial forces, were embarrassingly defeated by Rebel strike teams, as well as the primitive yet powerful natives known as Ewoks. This failure led to the deaths of Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader, the destruction of the second Death Star, and the end of the Empire. So images like this are what sticks in people's memory. But though the Empire was collapsing, many of these elite troopers would be picked up by regional Imperial warlords, desperate to hold on any power and with hope one day reinstate the Empire. And that's how we see them under the command of Moff Gideon. So that's it for the Scout Troopers, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. Scout Troopers were first seen in Return of the Jedi on Endor, but have since appeared in numerous video games and comics, as well as the shows Star Wars Rebels and The Mandalorian. Their use as snipers originated in LucasArts video games, and that role has continued to the present day, with Scout Troopers fulfilling the sniper role in the recent Battlefield 2 game, while they also make a cool appearance in Jedi Fallen Order, now having that melee combat role. It's pretty cool that the speeder bikes in Return of the Jedi were full-size models, and we see that they're almost identical to the early concept art. Additional information from this video comes from Star Wars: The Complete Visual Dictionary, Ultimate Star Wars, and the Imperial Handbook. But most important of all, remember, no amount of training can prepare you for plot-powered teddy bears, and the Force will be with you, always.
Kessel. It's a mining colony, but the Imperials often keep political prisoners here too.
What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is going to be all about the Legends history and breakdown of Kessel. If you saw the canon version, I mentioned how this is one of the most changed with planets in all of Star Wars. I mean, just look at it. The Legends version wouldn't even be called a planet by NASA standards, not having a spherical shape, so it's more of a planetoid or an asteroid. And the history is completely different as well. I'd say it's a lot more crazy and interconnected to the other lore, so let's just jump right into it. Kessel is located at grid coordinates T10, in the Outer Rim territories. It rotates around one sun, named Kessa, and has one moon, which was called the Garrison Moon. A day is 26 hours long and a year is 322 days. And here you can see how that differs from the canon Kessel and other important worlds. Because of this bean shape, there are a couple different numbers for the diameter, being 6,632 kilometers at the narrowest point, and 7,980 kilometers at the widest, which would make it a little more than half the size of Earth, and about 60 times the Death Star 1. Now there was no atmosphere at first, but as factories popped up, the emissions eventually built up a very thin atmosphere that got it a Type 3 ranking, meaning it was still too thin to breathe for most organics. It was also described as being very cold, and as you might expect, the terrain was all just flats, craters, tunnels all throughout the world, and countless rocky mountains. But interestingly, there are some native species: the energy spider, Taras Chai, and Bogey. The simplest were those bogies, being about 5 centimeters or about 2 inches, and completely composed of just energy, having no mass and can pass through anything, but drain the power of many electronics. The Celestials, those beings that shaped the galaxy eons before even the most ancient of empires, created an absurdly complex machine under the surface of Kessel, a machine that was sort of an astrological clock, with these bogies somehow being able to collect data from other beings and tech that later arrived on Kessel. Somehow they transmitted that to the Celestials on another plane of existence. So the bogies are like a bridge between realms, but could still be interacted with from beings from our plane, namely the energy spiders. Also known as spice spiders, the glitter stem in their webs would trap the bogies, an interaction that released light and attracted the spiders, who would then consume them as their main food source. There was also the Taras Chai, the small 3-centimeter insects that would often be eaten by the slaves that were forced to work the many spice mines. But this glitter stem material in the spider's webs was one of the most sought-after drugs in the galaxy. And millennia of these webs being spun in the tunnels on Kessel led to the glitter stem seeping into the dust and rock that comprised this world. And it was the only source of glitter stem in the entire galaxy. But something that's often overlooked is that in Legends, one of the effects of glitter stem is that it gave you telepathic abilities. They only last a short time as the drug quickly wears off. But you really gotta keep in mind what it is that you are consuming. The interdimensional godlike celestials used the bogies as a sort of light code, downloading information from the species and tech they came across, and somehow passing that information over to celestials on a different plane. Those bogies are then trapped in the glitter stem, the only material that seems to stop them. And then they're eaten by these spiders that produce even more glitter stem. This drug, or spice, interacts with every sentient species in the galaxy, and then gives them the ability to communicate outside of the normal limits of the closed physical universe. A hallucinogen that was placed here by the gods and that connects you to this separate realm. I think it's safe to say that these Legends lore writers were reading a lot of McKenna or Graham Hancock. Things like psychedelic mushrooms that are literally called the flesh of the gods in certain cultures. So although in canon spice is almost exclusively a negative thing, at least in Legends this glitter stem seems to be a lot like hallucinogens here on Earth. And that similar complexity of being stigmatized and worshipped by certain people seems to have existed in the galaxy far, far away. But in both Legends and canon, the problem is that crime syndicates are able to refine it to be incredibly dangerous and addictive. And there were enormous profits in this, dating back to at least 25,000 BBY, with Zim the Despot taking over Kessel and locking down the spice market. But of course it would be targeted by every crime lord over the millennia. Even the ancient Sith had tombs and ruins here, though the exact reason and purpose for them being on this planetoid is still unknown. The Hutts and Pikes would have the biggest influence in the modern era, setting up many factories and bringing in thousands of slaves. But the Empire eventually locked the planet down for themselves. Early into their rule, they set up at least 3 detention centers, and now any Imperial dissidents could find themselves being worked to death mining the spice, which they would have claimed could have been used for legitimate medicines, but it was rumored to have been used to prop up whatever crime boss the Empire was using at that time. He who controlled the spice controlled the galaxy, in the sense that every criminal warlord was now made or broken by the Emperor. Where crime could flourish and which lords would rule the underworld were in complete control of the Empire, at least in theory, as it was an evil symbiotic relationship which allowed the Empire to justify their infringement on civil liberties. Just as Palpatine controlled both sides of the Clone Wars, the Emperor's war on crime was manipulated similarly, with the ability to make or break criminal empires with the flow of spice. And so Kessel had to be highly regulated, with 700 personnel overseeing 10,400 prisoners, but with the prisoners being ranked and pitted against each other as well. An interesting psychological trick to make ambitious and skilled prisoners feel as if they were in control of something, even with a life sentence on the most infamous rock in the galaxy. Also, that 700 personnel was just the Imperial humans, but a lot of the running of the station was via the Colicoids, a creepy insect species that built a lot of the CIS ships, vehicles, and droids. This was the same species who had cathedral-like shipyards, and thought that design itself was something holy. So I wonder if they felt any reverence in managing an operation that mined the substance that connected the psychic and physical planes, as this Imperial Colicoid alliance is extremely odd. Even before the Battle of Yavin, the Rebel Alliance had launched some daring raids on Kessel to rescue some POWs. And in a separate incident, the notorious Tiber Zahn staged a prisoner revolt and escaped with one of his allies. To tighten this up, the Imps put several enormous satellites in orbit to better connect the individual camps to the protecting fleets, which included at least 1 Victory class, 2 Acclamators, and 2 Tartan-class patrol cruisers, along with dozens each of TIE fighters, interceptors, and bombers, and even a squad of TIE defenders. Zahn was actually crazy enough to come back with some of his consortium and take these forces on, with some accounts saying that he defeated all of the Imperial forces. When Admiral Akbar was captured by Boba Fett, he was on his way to what was likely a death sentence working the mines of Kessel. But luckily, the Star Destroyer that was transporting him was raided by Renegade Squadron, though Wedge Antilles was actually imprisoned on Kessel, and was even scheduled for execution, getting as close as being packed onto the train that was taking him to the death camp, when Luke and Rogue Squadron were able to show up and save the day, freeing Antilles and rolling this victory into freeing the majority of the prisoners on Kessel. At this point in its history, the Imps had installed several atmosphere generators, but when word of the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Endor, the commanders decided to shut these systems off. and simply work the prisoners remaining to death in this thinning atmosphere. But after liberating Kashyyyk, Solo, Lando, and Chewie, along with a contingent of Wookiee soldiers, all headed to the rescue. They were able to get the atmosphere back pumping, and eventually saved all of the prisoners. A civil war would break out amongst the Imperials, involving Hyssa, Trioculus, and Morith Dul. They all ended up torturing and betraying each other trying to hold on to power, and they would keep it out of New Republic hands up until 13 ABY. Here, Nin Nub would be put in charge of the spice capital of the galaxy. He was put in place by Lando Calrissian, who, with the Imperials taken care of and the New Republic unsure what to do with it, the lifetime hustler was able to legally purchase these mines. And this is the point you can start making your conspiracy videos on how Han and Lando teamed up to finesse all of the crime bosses and even the Emperor out of the sole spice-producing planet in the galaxy, leading a whole rebellion just to become legal, monopolistic spice lords. Luke's wife, Mara Jade, helped with the general operation of Calrissian's various business ventures, but it was Nin Nub who came up with the idea of using blind, sentient species like the craniopods to work the mines. No longer slaves, they were paid a good wage, as the medicinal and safe recreational use of spice was such a profitable business that Lando and Nub were swimming in credits, turning what was once a place synonymous with hell, where slaves were worked to death, into a career that a lot of people actually sought out, with greatly increased quality of living on site, and even the craniopods setting up thriving communities. But to bring this story full circle, when Leia and Han were helping to map out some of the uncharted tunnels, they discovered a fissure in the rock caused by a quake. This new opening led to a city-sized area, containing new life forms like fungi, centipedes, and different forms of spiders, along with a sort of miniature hawkbat. Much more biodiversity than you see elsewhere on Kessel, like some sort of hollow Kessel Earth. There was a whole world under the surface. This is when Leia was able to sense that those bogies flying about were actually transferring information into a different realm. And she was the one that connected the dots on the ancient machinery, seeing that it must all somehow have been crafted by and serving some purpose to the Celestials. After this, we don't hear a lot from Kessel, except for when the Yuuzhan Vong invaded. It was one of the many places that they captured. That's it for its history and breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. Order 66 survivors hid out there in one of the abandoned mines, and tried to lure Darth Vader into a trap. It didn't work. No Jedi escaped. And there's a detail that's kind of confusing, but there was a Republic-run prison/mining operation on Kessel before the Empire. Cassar Forge was a teacher in this program and helped convicts to learn how to re-enter society upon release. He would also end up being the father of 2 Rogue Squadron pilots, Lujane and Inriri. Its moon, named Garrison Moon, was destroyed by a prototype Death Star laser, which was concealed in the maw which enveloped Kessel. This moon is also known as the Sky Bogey by miners, a sort of larger version of the small bogies that floated around Kessel. In the original script, the word was written as Kissel, Kissel, and in the work, The Second Kessel Run, Kessel was depicted as being a lush, giant, fungy forest planet. But when making the Essential Atlas, this was retconned into being Little Kessel, a world near the Kessel Run. But the new Essential chronology still had Kessel looking like a greenish-blue spherical world, and that's how it's shown in Star Wars Galaxy Jump to Lightspeed and Battlefront Renegade Squadron. And so that's probably why it looks different in canon. A lot of additional information comes from these sources. If you want to pick them up, or the real-world books that lay out some of the theories on hallucinogen connections to different realms, the stuff that seems to have inspired the Star Wars lore on this, all that's linked down below. But most important of all, remember, the Emperor was kind of a failure. The real masterminds were Lando and Nin Nub, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is going to be a bit shorter and a lot more informal, but while making part 2 of Ahsoka's complete life, I noticed something that was really interesting. This symbol that we first see on Mortis was later seen on Ilum and even the Jedi Temple on Lothal. This is going to get really crazy, and I definitely want to hear your opinions on this, so be sure to comment them down below. And I'll just lay out all the similarities and connections between these 3 sites, and how it points to the ones being the precursors or creators of the Jedi Order, at a time that would be much further back than any Star Wars material has ever covered. So this symbol is first seen on many different spots on Mortis. I noticed that it was also outside of the structure on Ilum, in this circle where the younglings have to call on the Force to open the temple up. And then when we go inside, we see that it's all over the walls, and again on the floor in multiple locations. The only other place we ever saw this was on Mortis, and it would be on no other location in the Clone Wars. And then we only see it once in Rebels in the Lothal Temple. In both locations, the architecture is very Mortis-like. On Ilum, when the entryway is revealed, look how similar this is to the spire from the Father's dwelling on Mortis. Both here and on Lothal, the exterior is made to look like it is a part of nature, but descends away to reveal the entrance. And inside of both, the lines and angles, doorways, and just overall look is very similar to Mortis. And we also saw that these locations on the ground containing the symbol required the being that was tested to stand inside of it, like when the Father conducted the test to see if Anakin was truly the chosen one. Similarly, the younglings on Ilum stand in this circle containing the Mortis symbol in order to open up this location. And then with Kanan and Ezra, we get the same idea for the Lothal Temple. Which a really cool detail when they made this episode, and something which makes me think that this does have a connection, something that you really had to pay attention to see, is that throughout this entire episode you never get a good top-down angle. You can't see this symbol until the very end. If you look close, you can just barely see it here, kinda covered in grass, and clearly something that the Rebel Show creators did on purpose. Just faint enough to miss it, but if you knew where to look, you would see this Mortis symbol. For more connections, this is also the place where Ezra gets his Kyber crystal, the exact same reason that the younglings went to Ilum. All three of these locations also serve to test their visitors. Anakin was shown visions of the future, and haunted by the visions of the past in the form of his mother, while Ahsoka would see a vision of her future self, which tested her confidence in her future as Skywalker's Padawan. Obi-Wan's faith in Anakin would also be tested. Basically, this whole arc was just a series of tests for this trio. Similarly, each of the younglings on Ilum were tested in ways particular to each of their weaknesses. And as we would expect, we see the same thing with Ezra at the Lothal Temple, being plagued with vision after vision that test his fear of losing his master, Kanan Jarrus, and his insecurities as being one of the newest members of the Spectres. Remember, Mortis is a place where the Ones, known only as the Father, the Daughter, and the Son, called home. A location that was in a plane of existence outside of the normal galaxy. They were originally from the normal Star Wars galaxy, but the Father states that long ago he decided that their powers in the Force were too great.
My children and I can manipulate the Force like no other. Therefore, it was necessary to withdraw from the temporal world.
To anyone who might dismiss this arc as some weird one-off, or just something not important to the lore overall, I would point to a lot of things coming back from this arc. Ahsoka is revived here via a Force transfer, something that obviously played a big role in Episode 9, and I think it's the first time this is ever shown on screen. And then things like the bird that represents the daughter having this still not fully understood connection with Ahsoka, while what might be the most important of all is the time travel aspect introduced in Rebels, with the past and the future of both Anakin and Ahsoka being a major factor in the Mortis arc, and we see the Ones being on the entrance to the world between worlds. The Mortis arc in the Clone Wars is both canon and Legends, but that arc was older and could have been easily just ignored in canon, leaving it to the sort of dream or hallucination explanation that a lot of fans went with. Instead, they bring the Ones back to be depicted on the gateway on Lothal. Not some sort of dream, but the very real world between worlds, which has doors that open up to different locations across the galaxy, allowing one to play with the rules of time. An ability that the Ones had, with the Father getting extremely mad at the Son for showing Anakin visions of his potential future. So their existence as being important in canon as well has definitely been cemented in the new lore. But what I'm saying is that this connection with the symbols and the similarities of these locations is that the Ones may have been the originators of the Jedi Order. I think that's the breadcrumbs we're supposed to follow from both Rebels and the Clone Wars. An order which in the past must have also included practice of what later Jedi would call the dark side. On Mortis, we see that the Ones know how the Jedi view themselves and the Sith, and see the Jedi Order's whole dichotomy to be incredibly oversimplified. The Jedi's weapon is the lightsaber, and its power comes from the Force coming through the Kyber crystal. These crystals work as a gateway between the physical world and the metaphysical power of the Force. If we are to believe that the Lothal Temple, the entry to the world between worlds, and the Ilum Temple were all built by the Ones, then it seems that while the Father decided to remove himself from the galaxy in order to keep some sort of balance, he created these locations to test worthy individuals across the ages. As the Ones were once physical, and became purely non-physical, the Ones made these Kyber crystals to act as a conduit, a physical thing that can channel the Force into a weapon that can be used by both those who wish to spread light and those who wish to spread dark. A power that you could only receive if you could pass the trial in the buildings that each bear this Mortis symbol. And this role of the Kyber crystal is also the role of the Force user themselves. Again, as if the writers are trying to give us clues here, the very first words we see spoken inside of the Ilum Temple are these.
The Force, made physical, a Jedi is. Comes great responsibility with that, yes?
Yoda is saying that the Jedi is a conduit through which the Force can take action in this physical world. While the embodiment of the Force is on Mortis, this physical universe would be the greatest test site of all. While Ilum and Lothal had their specific tests for their specific goals, it is as if the ones use this physical universe as one big test of character. The Father wants there to be dark and conflict with the light, and ensures that if you are to embark in this struggle, you too will be tested. With most of the greatest Jedi throughout the ages, all seeing life as a series of trials placed on you by the Force itself. This naturally got me thinking of Kreia, who I think rightly identified the Force as the font of all suffering. That in this setup, where Force-sensitive beings receive immense power to do good or enormous amounts of evil, in a universe where souls of each and every being are constantly tested with hardship, you could prevent all of this if only you could destroy the Force. And interestingly, the Vong from outside the galaxy that the ones originated from do not interact with the Force at all, neither using it or being affected by it. So if we want to think in terms of legends, as the ones and Mortis also exist in legends, it's kind of cool to think how all this could sync up. So I just thought that was all really neat. Not sure what they'll do with that, but I definitely think that these ancient Jedi sites were actually created by the ones, and may play a larger role in Star Wars metaphysics in general. I don't know how I didn't catch these symbols being in all three of these places before, but definitely let me know if you did, and comment what you make of all of this. But most important of all, remember, it's all one big Force trial, and the Force will be with you, always. We all know how Krennic got his credit stolen with the Death Star project, but also the amazing Delta-class shuttle would have never been produced if it wasn't for the keen eye of the director.
We stand here amidst my achievement, not yours!
What's up, MetaNerdz? This video will be a complete breakdown in history of the Delta-class T-3C shuttle. It was most famously used by director Orson Krennic, and it has a ton of features that make it one of the most unique shuttles in the galaxy. The Delta class was manufactured by Cygnus Spaceworks and Sinar Fleet Systems, the creators of all the Empire's other iconic folding wing-style shuttles. These were officially called the Abecedarian line of shuttles, and the ship's engineer Lamia Tion got the inspiration for these wings from her love of paper folding art, the Star Wars origami, and saw that it had a practical purpose of reducing the footprint in the hangar. With the wings in the upright position, the Delta had a height of 25.1 meters, or 82 feet and 4 inches, which is roughly an Ewok plus a Wookiee taller than an AT-AT, while its length of 14.39 meters, or 47 feet 2 inches, was more than twice that of the TIE Fighter. There are no official numbers for its width, but it appears to be around 50 meters or 164 feet when in flight, which would be about 8 TIE Fighters across. Now these long wing-like structures may seem impractical, but they were the result of some really interesting engineering. Almost all of the Imperial shuttles produced by Sinar Fleet Systems and Cygnus Spaceworks have these origami-inspired wings. The first reason was, as I mentioned, just to take up less room in the hangar. When its 4 landing pads came out, there was a nice sturdy base, with all of its profile going up instead of out to the sides. We take this for granted with the Empire, but just imagine how impractical something like the Naboo ships would be sitting inside of a military hangar. These wings also gave it better stability in the wide range of atmospheres that the Delta class would be slicing through. But I would say the most impressive engineering aspect is that each of these wings are lined with deflector shield projectors. Ships have deflector shield generators usually located in the main body of the ship, often right near the bridge or cockpit, but it is your projectors that send out the shield to create a protective bubble around the ship. That's why you can have phrases like,
"Switch all power to front deflector strain."
Try and hold them off. Angle the deflector shield while I make the calculations for the jump to light speed.
So it isn't like there's separate shield generators in each of those locations, but shorthand for saying that you want to put more power into projecting that shield to a particular area. But in the case of the Delta class, they actually did put 2 separate deflector shield generators, and then designed these wings so that they split up space around it into 3 separate parts, and each of these wings were lined with multiple shield projectors. 2 generators and numerous projectors gave you a highly refined response to any incoming attacks. And we can imagine that mastering this complex shield projector system required some of the top talent in the Empire. And the Delta class had a 6-man crew, a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, gunner, comms operator, and engineer. And with their talents, they were able to triangulate the projection of the shields, or even triangulate to multiple locations at once since you had those 2 separate generators. All of this meant that it wasn't just a vague forward or rear, but pinpointed to anywhere in this sphere of coverage. The wings also housed the secure HoloNet and subspace transmitter arrays, allowing the Delta class to stay in constant contact with the Empire, even while in the most remote parts of the galaxy or even in hyperspace. And then the tips of each of these wings also had their own laser cannon, in addition to the 2 dual laser cannons mounted on the hull. All of these systems required an enormous amount of power and fuel, which made up a majority of the volume of the interior of the main body, which is also where they house the enormous pair of ion engines. We get a good look at the thrust that these can generate when it took off from the secret weapons facility on Iadu. When the engines engaged, they sent Jyn Erso flying off the platform. These SFS-215 ion engines could get it up to a top atmospheric speed of 1,000 km per hour, or 621 miles per hour, making it just a bit slower than the X-Wing, tied with the Sentinel-class shuttle, and an impressive 150 km per hour faster than the Lambda. This engine array would also house the hyperdrive, which included the top-of-the-line SFS IG-45 Class 1 hyperdrive, along with a backup Class 10. This gave the shuttle the ability to transport its VIPs across the galaxy in as quick a time as possible, being faster than an Imperial Star Destroyer, and only highly modified ships like the Millennium Falcon were faster. On top of all this, the entire ship was wrapped in this radar-scrambling skin, this black paint job containing material that was similar to the Death Trooper's armor, which was covered in a spray polymer called Reflect, something that would alter the electromagnetic waves utilized by most sensors. As for its history, originally Sinar Fleet Systems created the Delta class as a sort of concept ship, something that could test the theory of a stealth shuttle with these great shield-projecting wings. But like most awesome concept designs, they never intended to actually produce these in great numbers. No Delta-class shuttles were slated to be incorporated into the Empire until director Krennic set his eyes on the design. He was attracted to the look, but he fell in love with the ship's capabilities, being the ultimate shuttle for one who wished to traverse the galaxy quickly while remaining undetected, and all the while be impervious to any chance of attack by pirate gangs or rebels with that impressive shield array. The official cost once it was sold to the Empire was 160,000 credits, which is only 20k more than the Lambda, and a little more than 2 TIE fighters, and the one that Krennic picked up was designated ST-149. But to put this ship in context, it's important to remember that most of the Imperials wanted their position for the privileges it provided. In the time of the Empire, political power was the ultimate status symbol and best means to luxury. No longer strength, hard work, intellect, or your credits. As you would expect, the Imperial shuttles had lavish quarters for the important imps on board, but not Krennic's shuttle. The cabin was specialized for the 6 Death Troopers that escorted him everywhere, and even his personal quarters were very Spartan. The Delta could carry 30 passengers, which in Krennic's case might just be filled with more troopers or other research VIPs. And your standard amount of supplies on board were said to last for 3 months. Though not a mainstay like the Lambda or Sentinel, Krennic would use this ship for over a decade. We saw it in 0 BBY being used to go kidnap Galen Erso, later at the research station on Iadu, and then to Mustafar to visit Darth Vader's castle, before meeting its ultimate end on Scarif. The shuttle would have likely been destroyed by the debris raining down from the main tower on Scarif after Krennic got sniped by the Death Star. If not by this debris, then it was likely vaporized as the explosion spread. That's it for its breakdown, but there's some really cool additional facts and behind-the-scenes stuff I wanted to mention. There was one other person that was known to use the Delta-class shuttle. It was Imperial Inspector Magna Tolvan, who used it during her hunt for the hacker and archaeologist Dr. Aphra between the years 0 to 3 ABY. There's also kind of a funny lore play on the intense rivalry between Krennic and Tarkin, with Tarkin always finding ways to appear more important than Krennic, being something that is mirrored in their ships. Tarkin has an actual stealth ship, the Carrion Spike, that can go invisible not just to equipment but even the naked eye, while Krennic of course only has the next best thing, just under it, number 2 on the list of best stealth ships in the galaxy as it were. Also, the Carrion Spike was considered to be the fastest ship in the Imperial Navy, despite both having a Class 1 hyperdrive. This may be the result of a variety of factors that make it slightly faster when traveling through the Blue Void, but it's also hilarious to think that they might be the same speed, and Tarkin's ship just gets the title of fastest in the Empire. There's also a funny story with Krennic's personal aide, Captain Dunstig Taro, whose role it was to keep Krennic up to date with important Imperial messages, while also acting as the ship's pilot for a majority of the time. Taro came to love the Delta class so much that he nicknamed the ST-149 the Pterodon, the ancient flying reptile having a similar profile with its enormous wings and its head protrusion, while also being a play off of his own name. The comic that was mentioned earlier was Dr. Aphra 16, but when it appears here and in the Rogue One comic adaptation, it has a red engine glow despite being blue everywhere else. The Delta class also has its own LEGO set, and a ton of books that have expanded on its details, including the Rogue One Visual Guide, Cyclopedia of Starfighters, and most in-depth was the Dawn of the Rebellion RPG guide. So that's it for the Delta class T3C shuttle. But most important of all, remember, Erso had the genius, Krennic had the vision, but Tarkin understood politics. And the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is going to be a complete breakdown of the watery world of Mon Cala, also known as Dak. This planet has a ton of awesome details in both canon and legends, many of which are the same, but when they're exclusive I will have a canon or legend sign on the screen if you care about that distinction. This is one of the most fascinating planets in the galaxy, with some of the strangest plant and animal life, really weird locations, and a deep and rich history. So let's jump into it. We should point out that the Quarren in their Quarrenese language, and in the eponymous Mon Calamari language, both refer to this planet as Dak, but the Mon Calamari were a more technologically advanced species than the Quarren, having already spread out and studied a few of their nearest celestial bodies by the time the human representatives of the Republic made first contact. That was way back in the year 4166 BBY. Because these were the people they met with, the planet was named after them in the Republic's database. The name stuck from then on out, but I will use both names throughout the video. This world was located at coordinates U6 on the galactic map, being in the Outer Rim territories in the Calamari sector within the Mon Calamari system, which was a binary star system with 8 orbits. The first planet was Mo Luxu, a barren, rocky planetoid with no moons. Dak was number 2 with 1 moon, that was much like our moon here on Earth. At the third position was the uncreatively named Iceberg 1, which was simply a large ball of ice. But it too had a moon. Fourth orbit was Iceberg 2, followed by Mon Aron. This world was one of those that the Calamari had discovered and eventually terraformed to act as a colony. That world had 2 moons, while it was followed by the gas giant Sep Elopon and its 32 moons. Not much could be done here except for mine the gases, and it is unknown if any of those moons were ever utilized. And in the last 2 orbits are Iceberg 3 and 4. Though there is constant debate amongst both Republic and Calamari astronomers stating that both of those icebergs should really be considered comets that were just captured by the binary stars. Now that we know about its celestial neighborhood, let's head down to Mon Cala itself. With a diameter of 11,030 kilometers or 6,854 miles, it was just a bit smaller than Earth and more than twice the size of Mustafar. Its rotation period, or day, and orbital period, or year, were also similar to Earth, at 21-hour days and 398 days in a year. The atmosphere was Type 1, which was breathable for most species, and had moderate temperatures as well as standard gravity. Almost the entire surface was covered in water, but there were some locations that poked up above the waves. While the Quarren evolved in the deepest parts of the oceans, the Mon Calamari grew up in the water but would also go up on land. This amphibious nature is what saved the species early on, when the Quarren attacks nearly made the Calamari go extinct. But the ability to regroup and take refuge on these islands, while also use this as a place to manufacture weapons, allowed them to turn the tide of this early tribal warfare, to the point that the Quarrens were the ones that were almost extinct. While these bits of landmass are so few and far between, this advantage set them on course to technological dominance over their underwater neighbors for the rest of history. Eventually these islands would be expanded, along with adding completely artificial island cities. The capital, Mon Cala City, would remain underwater, but there were major sites like Dak City and New Coral City that were above water and acted as major ports. While many, like Bell City, would have major sections both above and below the water, acting like a comfy place to live for the natives, with short transit times to the busy hubs visited by offworlders. Tarkin once said, quote, "Mon Cala is a valuable world in many ways, its people, technology, and civilization. Why, Emperor Palpatine himself enjoys the Mon Calamari Aquatic Ballet." That was the show going on while Palpatine told Anakin the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise, and there were several of these performing arts centers spread across Mon Cala. The Mon Caladrome was an enormous and incredibly elegant opera house that rose out just above the surface to allow easy access to off-world visitors. While there were also resort cities like those of Crystal Reef, so called because it was situated near the icebergs of the Northern Pole. This playground had numerous gambling facilities, and would end up hosting some criminal organizations like Black Sun. And there were even pod racer courses at Orotoro Ga'am, and at the nearby Grand Reefs. So there was tons of entertainment both on-world and as cultural exports. But at the end of the day, the major exports were still seafood, and the high-tech equipment for starships and weapons. While the imports were the diverse foods and medicines that could be acquired from a galaxy-spanning economy. Also taking in some valuable tech as well, with things like hyperdrives being the miracle of space travel that opened the world up to endless opportunities. But the Mon Calamari made shields that were considered one of the best credits could buy, so you can see why it was so crucial to the Republic. By the time of the Clone Wars, the population of Dak was 27.5 billion. with 49% Quarren, 46% Mon Calamari, a surprisingly high 4% human, and 1% listed as other. One of the most interesting other were the Whalodons. These are a sentient whale-like species that never developed any technology, but which could intelligently communicate with others via their sing-song language. Early on in the Mon Calamari rule over this planet, they had outlawed any hunting of the Whalodon. But later when the Empire took over, they saw these majestic creatures simply as a great source of protein, setting up processing centers and flying in hordes of Aqualish to hunt them down and chop them up. But their entire history before that was really peaceful, with cities like Aquarius being built so that they could interact with other species, including offworlders. Aquarius being an enormous oxygen bubble dome city, providing for an incredible experience for O2 breathing visitors, who could walk around on the ocean floor without any dive suits, and some would even learn to speak with these enormous intelligent creatures. There was also a ton of other plant and wildlife in this watery world, and this is where things get really weird. I truly believe that Mon Cala has some of the most insane, complex, and just overall interesting life in the entire galaxy. You'll see that a lot of them focus on their telepathic ability. Starting off is the Amphihydrus, a simple looking frog that has the interesting ability of mind control, and these things are considered force sensitive. Just think about how many sapient species out there in the galaxy, like humans, only have a tiny fraction of their population that are force sensitive, whereas this entire frog species can use telepathy to control their prey. Studies have shown that they were exclusively utilizing the dark side of the Force. This once became a planet-wide emergency with the boom of off-world trade, as things like rancors were being imported to Dak. The Amphihydrus essentially launched numerous terrorist attacks across major cities, making the rancors and similar large beasts go on killing sprees, to the point that the Empire had to step in and launch a war on these frogs. Try to make them go extinct, but there are still traces of small communities of these Darksider amphibians across the world. And an interesting thing to consider, though not directly addressed by the lore, is if they can control sapient offworlders. It doesn't seem like the native larger beings like the Quarren, Calamari, or Whalodons were ever affected by them, perhaps due to some natural defenses against psychic attacks that we would expect to naturally arrive when you develop on a world with so many telepathic creatures. But most species of offworlders would likely have no defenses, so let me know what you think about this in the comments. Blobfish were more simple creatures that live in the sea trees, and would travel through the kelp forest in swarms of thousands. Their main threat was the blossoming gulper, which had limbs that resembled the sea tree, using these as a lure while it burrowed itself into the sandy sea floor. These sands were also the home to coral worms, which were considered a delicacy by several different species, while cubicle worms were a threat to the pod racers on the Grand Reefs. The Dak anchovy was loved across the galaxy, but some, like the famous chef Dexter Jetster, had a dangerous allergy to these and Mon Calamari. Cowl were crab-like creatures whose shells were so strong that they were used by the Mon Calamari Knights as a shield. The devil squid was one of the most fearsome creatures under the seas, dominating the deepest regions of Dak called the Devil's Crevasse. At around 10 meters or 33 feet, these things were used as war squids by Imperial Knight Tree Sind in 137 ABY. He used the Force to control several of them in his fight against the even more powerful Sea Leviathan, a creature that was not a natural life form native to Dak, but a Sith spawn, an alchemically engineered horror. The Great Ungnis Trench was one of the largest trenches on Mon Cala, and which also housed some of this world's most terrifying creatures, the as yet unnamed giant squid-like monstrosity that once attacked Darth Vader. While the Krakana was like a shark but with numerous spiked appendages, and even more feared than the larger monstrosities just mentioned. Because while you were unlikely to ever encounter one of those giant squids, this creature was known to roam throughout the entire planet, snatching up natives and intensely feared by offworlders. It was related to the larger Keelkana, which were used as mounts by the Calamari Knights. While a type of crustacean called the Titan Cantray was used for its armor, its skin being tough yet pliable to make this protective suit. The Lee Rome was a type of clam that was used to hold the crown of the monarch of the Mon Calamari, and then there was the Mon Cala eel that was harnessed as a torture device on prisoners, as well as the scarier Chorn, an eel that would often resort to cannibalism and was considered a delicacy by the Quarrens, and by no one else. Flailers were leech-like creatures that would suck your blood, and of course there were countless types of fish, many of which were kept as pets, with Calamari debating as to which ones were the smartest, much like many dog breeds here on Earth. The organic gill was a bioengineered species. It naturally converted water into oxygen, and with some tweaking they could be mass-grown and altered to sell as a face mask for offworlders, acting as a more efficient and environmentally friendly form of diving gear. Trumpetweed was a plant that when fossilized was seen as a beautiful piece of natural art by many species. Quarren Senator Tikes gave some of these to the Naboo Senator Palpatine, even including enormous pearls to set up on top. And one tourist attraction was that once a year, billions of single-celled algae bloomed, causing a green stripe across the equator of the planet. But the last two creatures I want to mention are the most noteworthy telepaths. The Moapa were a telepathic species that would normally float through the seas as individuals, but could physically link for both offense and defense, which also turned them from mindless organisms into a great collective intelligence. During the Clone Wars, they would align with the Quarren Isolation League, and one grouping even attacked Kit Fisto. Once he learned how intelligent this race could be, he ordered that the Calamari send diplomats, initiating talks that would eventually lead with a treaty with this unique species. But the strangest organism has to be the Knowledge Bank. In canon, they are simply known as the Intelligent Mollusk, and Senator Tikes had at least one of them relocated to a pool inside of his office, located in the Senate building. They are sapient, bivalve mollusks found deep on the ocean floor. Their telepathic abilities are so powerful that the bank collectively forms a sort of computer archive, recording the thoughts of all life on Mon Cala, using the oceans as a giant connected medium, and controlling the minds of many fish species, acting as sorts of Wi-Fi extenders across the globe. Relays that would spread their telepathic ability so that they could collect the thoughts of everything throughout the years, developing a complete history of the planet through the eyes of each that lived it. When off-worlders came to visit, it would read their minds as well, developing a deep understanding of the galaxy at large. When Leia met with them, she reasoned that they must have a connection with the Force. And unlike those evil frogs, they seemed to be aligned with the light, reading the intentions of those who sought their wisdom, and only aiding enlightened Mon Calamari and Quarren, who would request knowledge through a complex religious ritual. While the minds of the off-worlders were unknowingly examined via the clam's fish spies, Leia is thought to be the only human to ever actually meet with the Knowledge Bank, and many of the native population had no clue where these mythological beings were, making me think that Senator Tikes' display on Coruscant had to be seen as either an outrageously offensive action, or the complete opposite, that the Knowledge Bank requested to have a member moved to the capital of the galaxy. What better place to collect even more information? And we can end the list of species with one mysterious artificial creature. One day over the seas near Foam Wander City, a strange metallic craft appeared, and suddenly dropped a device into the ocean. Soon after, nearby fishermen started hauling up 1.5 meter wide droids they called nanostars. It would move through a series of flexible screw appendages, and zap anything that came to investigate it. Their purpose and origin remain as one of the most confusing mysteries in the entire galaxy. So again, let me know what you think about them in the comments. As for its history, I already mentioned how the Mon Calamari's tech allowed them to become the dominant species on Dak. And though their government would change over the millennia, even at the time of the Clone Wars it was still a monarchy with a representative council. It was also an inherited throne, and this was a constant source of tension with the Quarren. Dooku had their king Yos Kulina assassinated, and pushed Quarren chieftain No Sarai to secede, dragging the entire planet into civil war. As soon as the Empire came to power, this was one of their first targets, mostly for the reasons Tarkin mentioned earlier, that if these fish folk denied the Emperor, it would be inspiring to many, and their tech would provide enormous military aid to any rebels. The siege of this world was intense, but the Mon Calamari were able to convert some of their cities into enormous starships, breaking through the blockade and fulfilling one of the Emperor's worst nightmares, as the Mon Cala fleets and expertise were the single largest addition to the Rebel Alliance. Later, they would find Imperial records that confirmed a fear that Luke Skywalker had experienced in a dream state, showing that just like his vision, after Alderaan, Mon Cala was sent to be destroyed by the first Death Star, and the first target of the second Death Star was this watery world. Later, during the rise of the First Order, history would repeat itself. This time it would be No Sarai's advisor, Gi, who wanted the Quarren to become the rulers of Dak, secretly contacting the First Order and reporting on the ships that were being made for the New Republic. General Hux would personally lead the attack, but we can assume that this was a Resistance victory. Now in the Legends timeline, the Mon Calamari and Quarren were able to drive off their Imperial overlords. These two species dedicating everything to the Alliance, and their shipyards would undergo continuous expansion and upgrades for over a century. They would be crucial to the defeat of the extragalactic invaders the Yuuzhan Vong, and the many Imperial remnant groups that rose up over the years. By the year 137 ABY, Mon Cala's orbital shipyard was larger than that of Kuat Drive Yards, the once undisputed King shipwright. But during the Second Imperial Civil War, this planet was again captured by the Empire. In an Alliance fleet counterattack, 1/3 of the shipyard was destroyed, and the Sith scientist Vol-Icin unleashed a poison that would spread throughout the entire watery world, an attempt by this new empire to eliminate the threats from Dak once and for all. The Alliance was only able to evacuate 20% of the 27 billion population of sapient creatures, like the Mon Calamari, Quarren, Whalodons, and Moapa, while all of the planet and animal life left behind was killed. Besides any of them that might be in captivity off-world, they were now completely extinct, including the Knowledge Bank. And this fate of Mon Cala was never reversed. Many of the survivors were transported to live inside of the orbital shipyard, but that's how it was left in Legends. The sad ending to one of the most vibrant, interesting, and important worlds in the entire galaxy. So that's it for Dak or Mon Cala, but you definitely want to hear the cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The very first mention of this planet was in the 1982 issue of Bantha Tracks, where they gave readers a preview of the Mon Calamari species, saying that they hailed from the planet Dak. Their home would later be called Calamari, Mon Calamari, Mons Calamari, and Mon Cala in various media over the decades. And the name Dak was for a time so obscure that people debated if it was canon. It wasn't until the RPG guide Geonosis and the Outer Rim Worlds brought it back, and then it would be called that in various other media throughout the years. The Water World would go on to become one of the most depicted planets in Star Wars media, perhaps the most of any world that was not in the films. Speaking of which, and this might really upset you, but that canon comic I mentioned where the First Order is assembling over Mon Cala simply ends and says continued in the Rise of Skywalker. This battle was not concluded in any other material, so I have to guess that this was just another storyline that was abandoned in the new trilogy. To think we could have not only seen this world in a film, but a major space battle between one of the New Republic's greatest shipwrights. Don't think about it too long. This world has also appeared in a ton of video games and comics, and a lot of the details come from there, but mostly the Essential Atlas, the Guide to Warfare, and Ultimate Star Wars. But most important of all, remember, everyone's gangster till the fish start turning their cities into starships, and the Force will be with you. Always. Have you ever wondered what the fish folk starfighter would look like? What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is going to be really short, but I just wanted to cover a couple of Mon Calamari fighters that I think most people have never heard of. We all know that their capital ships are some of, if not the best capital ships in the entire galaxy, with their shield generators in particular being highly sought after. They were known to be some of the greatest shipwrights of all time, but we never saw their fighters. Actually we did, but they're just really obscure. So let me start with the canon one first. This is simply referred to as the Mon Calamari fighter, and its first and only appearance is in the comic Allegiance 4. This was part of the build-up to Rise of Skywalker. In it, we see that General No Sarai, who we last saw as the chieftain of the Quarren people during the Clone Wars, the one that was tricked by Dooku and Rift Tamsin into sparking a civil war against the Mon Calamari. That No Sarai was now a general, but was betrayed by his advisor, Gi. This advisor tried to align with the First Order, alerting them about resistant ships that were being built in the Calamari's enormous shipyards. General Hux would lead a massive invasion fleet, knowing this was a world proud of its great naval history. As they all feared the looming threat in orbit, No Sarai offers to atone for his traitorous man, taking a Mon Calamari fighter and weaving through the First Order fleet until he is finally shot down. But it was a sacrifice that brought precious seconds for the Calamari fleets to flee the planet before the FO could engage in orbital bombardment. Now if we take a closer look at the fighter, we can see that it has at least 2 laser cannons, one on each side, and it looks like only room for a single pilot. We might be able to infer that as he was able to lead the TIE FOs on such a long chase, and is only ultimately destroyed by a turbolaser from a capital ship, I think it's safe to say that this fighter would have had an abnormally powerful shield generator. Remember, great shields are what the Mon Calamari were known for. From the nose up to about halfway of this fighter evoke some of the design features of many Mon Cala craft, but the cockpit, fins, and really the entire back half is very similar to an A-Wing. This is 30 years after the Battle of Endor, and the A-Wing was considered one of the best interceptors ever made. So perhaps the Mon Calamari engineers and allies in the Republic simply built the Mon Calamari fighter off of its already proven ship design, adding some features of their own, but keeping the parts of the A-Wing that made it so swift, responsive, and deadly. Just making sure they slapped in one of their superior shield generator systems, and ensure that it was able to travel through water as well. And so that is the first and only sighting of this new Mon Calamari fighter. And the only one that we ever saw in Legends was this thing. But funny enough, even in Legends, we never see this ship used on Dak. But we did see this and its larger variant used during the first Battle of Kamino. Known as the Amphib, it would be used by Commander Mirai, a calamari who defected to the CIS, using these fighters in his assault on the main reactor of Taipoka City. I think the calamari hand in creating these is more obvious than that cannon fighter, and seems like a design that was purpose-made for use in a watery world. It too had a pair of laser cannons and a single pilot. But we get some cool frames inside of the ship, where we see it has an amazing cockpit layout with holographic displays and an augmented reality visor that the pilot would wear. And we even get a great line from the Mon Calamari critiquing the Jedi for defending a water world with ships that can't submerge. Luckily for the clones, the city had a pretty strong shield itself. As for the separatist Mon Calamari, he was quickly forced to eat his words, with those Jedi fighters unleashing a barrage that critically damages it. But with a pull from the tractor beam of a Lucre Hulk in orbit, combined with a final push from the Amphib's engines, it was able to get back into atmosphere. And here we see a really interesting thing in common across both canon and legends. Both the Quarren no Serai and the Mon Calamari Commander Mirai were willing to sacrifice everything at a moment's notice. He would set his Amphib to self-destruct right in the middle of the hyperdrive rings, preventing the Jedi fighters from being able to pursue his separatist Mon Calamari allies. So we get two different Mon Calamari fighter designs, but interestingly their stories have two very similar ends, and both were only depicted in a single comic and in no other Star Wars material. So I hope you were happily surprised to see a Mon Cal fighter existed, and I hope you enjoyed the parallels in their stories as much as I did. But definitely let me know which design you like more. I gotta say, I don't just like the Legends one more, I do think it's an objectively cool design, whereas I was kinda disappointed to see how the canon one just looks like a modded A-Wing, even if it does make some sense with the lore. And to make it even more interesting, I wanted to show you these fan designs for Mon Calamari ships. These are from Adam Kopp, and then there was this one by Josh Rubesh. I think they're all really cool, and I love that the artist made sure that they all look like they can travel both in and out of water, while also being very unique, and I don't know how, but they just capture a sense of Mon Cala. So out of all of them, comment your favorite. But most important of all, remember, every day you should thank the Force that Palpatine let his annoyance at Alderaan politicians get the best of him. There's plenty of worlds like Alderaan, but only one Mon Cala, and the Force will be with you, always.